that Scott Morrison doesn't take some of the advice, given some of the statements that have been made by the President of the United States, particularly about the social restrictions that are on in the US. I think that here in Australia we're doing much better than the US, and that's because people are not taking an opportunistic view of this crisis. People are listening to the health experts, and I hope that leaders around the world do that.
Just on a couple of other issues, we know that, of course, Virgin is in the spotlight. Former Virgin Blue chairman Chris Corrigan has defended the government's decision not to bail the airline out and says the owners...
Chris Corrigan's defended a coalition government.
Let me just get to the second part of the question.
I hope
don't
that's
interrupt.
not the lead.
Don't do too much interrupting. We know what people think of interrupting. And says the owners broke with the formula that made it successful. Does the commercial sector have to sort this out? Why should the government step in?
Well, the reason why Virgin have had a particular difficulty at this time is because of government policy. That's the first point. It is the government that have shut down the market, and so therefore it's pretty hard to see an immediate market-based solution when there's no market. Stating the obvious. The second point is that, is it in Australia's national interest to have two airlines operating domestically? My answer to that is yes. The aviation white paper said the answer to that was yes. And therefore, you have to work through a way that ensures that that happens. And we have to remember, this isn't about who the manager or CEO of Virgin is to me an issue neither here nor there. What I'm concerned about is the 16,000 workers who work directly or depend upon Virgin Australia for their jobs, to put food on the family table at night, to pay their mortgage, to pay their rent, to send their kids to school. I'm concerned about the hundreds of thousands of Australians who depend upon a viable domestic aviation system to, in effect, fuel the tourism sector. And I'm concerned about those jobs and that economic activity as well. And I'm also concerned about the millions of Australians who want to be able to fly at reasonable prices with a competitive system, be it for work or for recreation. And that's why the government has a responsibility to do something other than have a hands-off approach here.
Scott Morrison's going to push the World Health Organization to be allowed to enter a country without invitation to trace the origins of potential pandemic outbreaks. Is that something that you think is a good idea to try and, hopefully not repeat what we've seen with COVID-19?
Yes, it is. We need strong international global structures.
So what do we need here?
Well, I support what Scott Morrison has said. We need the World Health Organization is the only body that you could foresee being in a position to do this, which is why the decision by the United States, and I wonder whether Scott Morrison raised this with Donald Trump, the decision by the United States to withdraw funding is a very short-sighted decision indeed.
So I've got to pick you up on this. Just briefly, you say you hope it was raised. Do you hope that Scott Morrison, just to be clear, raised objections with the US president for that decision?
Yes, I do, because it isn't in Australia's interest, and it's not in the world's interest to undermine the World Health Organization. With all the problems that it's got, it's the only structure that could possibly get to the bottom of what this dilemma has been, and that's why I support Scott Morrison's call for the World Health Organization to be able to go in. Unfettered, it should have access to any records that it wishes to see, and we need to get to the bottom of this, because it's not just an academic exercise of history and how this pandemic has come about. It's about making sure that we have structures in place so it can never, ever happen again.
Just finally, have you read Malcolm Turnbull's book yet?
No, I haven't. I've been a little bit busy, but I do look forward to reading it. I've read some of the excerpts that have been published, and certainly much of the character assessments are there from senior members of the government. I find it particularly interesting that Scott Morrison told Malcolm Turnbull that he was supporting him at the time when his supporters were essentially saying they were backing up Tony Abbott. And that is why Malcolm Turnbull thinks that during the crisis that saw him removed as Prime Minister, Scott Morrison was playing a duplicitous game.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
That is Anthony Albanese. He's the leader of the opposition. Some interesting comments there too. Very strong support for the approach that Scott Morrison has taken on the World Health Organization, but a critique there, well, at least a question mark from Anthony Albanese, saying that he hopes that Scott Morrison in his phone call with Donald Trump raised the US's decision to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization. Global leaders are calling for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, including China's handling of the initial outbreak in the city of Wuhan. But Beijing has vowed to block any efforts to investigate its role in the spread of COVID-19. The Lowy Institute Director of Research, Alex Oliver, joins me this afternoon. Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure, Patricia.
The Prime Minister tweeted that he spoke to US President Donald Trump about working together to improve the transparency and effectiveness of international responses to pandemics. What should an international review look like to be successful?
Well, I think that's the second question, Patricia, actually. I think the first question is what is the review trying to achieve? And secondly is a question of timing. And I think, firstly, what it's trying to achieve, obviously, is, as Anthony Albanese mentioned earlier, is to examine the role of China, to examine exactly how the outbreak happened, how it was managed, and in order to avoid, obviously, such a global catastrophe happening again. It would also probably look at the role of the World Health Organization in that, development of the process. And the other is the question of timing. We're right in the middle of this pandemic, particularly for developing nations. It's just beginning. It's rather for developed nations, it's the end of the beginning and not the beginning of the end. And at this stage, as John McCarthy, who is a former Australian ambassador to India, Japan, the United States, and High Commissioner to India, had said this morning, playing the blame game right now might not be particularly productive, particularly when it comes after, as you mentioned earlier, a telephone call with Donald Trump. That gives the window to China, as China's foreign ministry spokesperson said, I think yesterday or the day before, that Australia is just acting as a deputy sheriff to the United States. So the timing is awkward, and I think perhaps the timing is not quite right yet.
Okay, so in terms of the way it should be run, should it be a pre-existing body like the G20 or a new entity? And really crucially, I suppose, what would it look like if China refuses to actually participate?
Well, I think that's highly likely. So the question is, the question I first raise is what would it achieve without the cooperation of China? What can it achieve? We're looking at the origins of the virus in Wuhan, the wet markets, how they operate, where else they are in China. Could this happen again in China? The idea that sunlight disinfects, which is something that's a bit of a Western concept, is not something that either President Xi or the CCP would subscribe to. And as my colleague Richard McGregor has noted in an opinion piece a couple of days ago, secrecy is a feature, not a bug, of the Chinese system. And under Xi, it's only been exacerbated. So it's not in China's interest to actually cooperate or facilitate with this. It's not in China's interest to reveal to the world what the weaknesses of its system might be, weaknesses that led to the development of this virus. So there's a very big question mark over what such an inquiry could achieve. Is it going to be like, for example, the International Court of Justice's investigation into MH17 without the cooperation of the Russians? it runs the risk of just being a sort of a Pyrrhic victory and uncovering, what evidence it can without the cooperation of China, which basically proves nothing. So there is a very big question mark over that. China has no interest, after its century of humiliation and the way it wishes to portray itself to the world, to have these sort of things uncovered.
What do you think then of this diplomatic push from world leaders, this kind of almost chorus around this?
Well, I think we'd all like to get to the bottom of it. It would be in everybody's interest to prevent such a crisis from recurring. I wonder if this is actually where the efforts of the international community should be focused. And you mentioned the G20 earlier in your conversation, and I think that I would rather see the international community put their efforts into a G20 type recovery response that was that characterised the global recovery from the global financial crisis. We haven't seen much from the G20. It's become something of a moribund institution. It was tremendously effective in the global response to the financial crisis. And yet here, several months after the outbreak, it really didn't convene properly as a group until late in March, sort of too late. And when it did, it came up with a raft of measures which had basically already been announced. I think we should be looking to the G20 as a group of the world's largest and wealthiest nations to provide the sort of leadership that it did during the financial crisis. And that's all sorts of things. It's sort of preventing a global descent into a sort of beggar thy neighbour protectionism. It's supporting the funding for the IMF. It's supporting the multilateral development banks. It's removing things like export restrictions on medical supplies, which we've seen a lot of countries engage in. These are very difficult policies which it would be very good to unwind, apart from generally underwriting the recovery of developing nations, because they are the ones in the largest.
How about just broader reform also of the World Health Organisation? As I was saying, there's been now a push from Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, for the World Health Organisation to be allowed to enter a country to get to the bottom of a pandemic. Does the World Health Organisation need more powers, need more teeth, need more muscle to be able to do this kind of work?
Yes, I think so. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of criticism of the World Health Organisation in its response to this. They've been, it's been criticised as being ineffectual, it's been criticised as being a spokesperson for China. There was that infamous tweet in mid-January suggesting that, China's research had said that there was no human transmission of the virus. So there are large question marks over whose independence of China and the way it has seemed to almost kowtow to China and its handling of the crisis, excessively praising China. So there are some real question marks over whose performance here. But it's the only organisation in the world that can actually, that is global and that can actually, is poised to assist developing nations in particular to ride out this crisis. There is no other organisation that can do it. So the fact that the United States has pulled its funding when it is the largest funding organisation, the fact that Australia itself has reduced its funding for the World Health Organisation is not particularly effective, runs the risk of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy if you keep withdrawing funding and then you criticise the organisation for being ineffective. How can you expect it's maximally effective if you've crippled it in terms of funding? So I think a review of the World Health Organisation is a good idea. I think its funding basis needs to be reviewed. I think the United States needs to be encouraged to come back into the fold, because of course you have influence when you are within, not from when you're outside an organisation. So I think that they are all critical moves, having a look at the funding structure to start with. Looking at who went wrong in this, and asking some hard questions of it as a political organisation, which it has shown itself to be in the way that it's responded to China and the way that it has blocked out Taiwan. These are all problems that I think the global community does need to address, and those with bigger stakes and the funding stakes in the World Health Organization are the best ones to do that.
Alex, thanks for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure, Patricia. Thank you.
That's the Lowy Institute Director of Research, Alex Oliver, talking to us about the World Health Organization and China and this investigation. There is bipartisan support for that investigation.